They handed me a single white carnation while his blood relatives carried roses. 15 years of marriage, and I was treated like a distant acquaintance at my own husband's funeral. But what they didn't know was that David had left me something far more powerful than flowers. Hidden in his old camera was evidence that would destroy them all, frame by frame. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed in the power of patience and kindness. I'm 52 years old, an art teacher at Cedar Ridge Elementary, and for the past 15 years I thought I was part of a family. I met David when I was 37, and convinced I'd missed my chance at real love. He was this gentle giant who owned Mitchell Construction, with calloused hands that could build anything and a smile that made me believe I deserved happiness. His first wife had died in a car accident when his son Kevin was 10, and David was raising the boy alone while running his business and caring for his aging mother. I should have seen the warning signs from our very first family dinner. David's sister Lisa made a point of seating me at the card table while everyone else sat at the dining room table. When I offered to bring dessert, his mother Margaret said it wasn't necessary because we already have everything we need. His brother Tom barely acknowledged my presence, and Kevin spent the entire evening asking when his real mom was coming back. David apologized later, explaining that they just needed time to adjust. I believed him because I wanted to belong somewhere so desperately. Our wedding was small, held in David's backyard because Lisa insisted the church was too expensive for a second marriage. Margaret wore black like she was attending a funeral instead of a celebration. Tom showed up drunk and made a toast about how David sure knew how to pick them, with a laugh that made my skin crawl. Only Kevin seemed genuinely happy, probably because I'd spent months winning him over with homemade cookies and help with his homework. I thought we were building something beautiful together. The first few years were everything I'd dreamed of. David and I transformed his house into our home, painting every room and planting a garden that became my sanctuary. I helped Kevin with school projects and attended every soccer game, cheering louder than any parent in the stands. David's family remained distant, but I convinced myself it was normal adjustment period behavior. Every holiday, every birthday, every family gathering, I arrived with hope and left with small wounds that I told myself would heal with time. David was a photography enthusiast, always carrying his vintage Nikon camera to family events. He said he wanted to document our life together, capturing moments that mattered. His study was filled with photo albums chronicling our adventures, from weekend trips to the lake cabin to quiet evenings in our garden. I loved watching him work in his makeshift dark room in the basement, developing film with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. Photography was his escape from the stress of running a construction company and managing family drama that seemed to follow us everywhere. The subtle cruelties started small. Lisa would plan family gatherings and forget to invite me, then act surprised when David asked where I was. Margaret would make comments about how different things were before, always with a pointed look in my direction. Tom would borrow money from David and somehow never have it when I was around to witness the repayment that never came. Kevin began testing boundaries as he got older, seeing how much disrespect he could show me before his father intervened. Each incident was small enough to overlook individually, but together they formed a pattern of systematic exclusion. David noticed but seemed powerless to change decades of family dynamics. He would apologize privately and promise to talk to them, but nothing ever really changed. I began to understand that in the Mitchell family hierarchy, blood trumped everything else. Marriage certificates and legal documents meant nothing compared to DNA and childhood memories. I was tolerated because David loved me, but I would never truly belong. Still, I stayed because I loved him more than I feared them, and I believed love would eventually win. 3 years ago, something shifted in the family dynamic. David's business was thriving, and he began talking about retirement and estate plan. Suddenly, everyone became very interested in family unity. Lisa started calling more often, always with questions about David's health and business decisions. Tom began showing up unannounced, usually when David was meeting with lawyers or accountants. Margaret moved into the guest house behind our home, claiming she needed help with daily activities, but somehow managing to monitor every conversation and visitor. Kevin's behavior became increasingly concerning during his college year. He dropped out after 2 semesters, claiming he needed to find himself, but spent most of his time in our basement playing video games and bringing home friends who made me uncomfortable. David tried to encourage him to work in the construction business, but Kevin showed no interest in actual labor. Instead, he seemed to have plenty of money for expensive clothes and electronics despite having no visible source of income. When I expressed concern to David, he brushed it off as normal young adult behavior. The photography hobby that had once been David's relaxation became something more obsessive. He started carrying his camera everywhere, even to family dinners and casual conversation. When I asked about it, he said he wanted to capture everything because life was precious and memories fade. He spent hours in his dark room, developing roll after roll of film. Sometimes I would hear him working late into the night, muttering to
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Himself as he examined negatives under his magnifying glass. The walls of his study became covered with photographs, but many of them seemed random and unartistic, nothing like his usual careful composition. David's health began declining 18 months ago. What started as occasional fatigue progressed to serious heart problems that required multiple medications and regular doctor visits. The family's concern was touching at first, with everyone offering to help with appointments and medication management. Margaret insisted on organizing his pill boxes, claiming her nursing background made her the obvious choice. Lisa volunteered to handle his business paperwork while he recovered. Tom offered to manage the construction crews and deal with clients. Even Kevin stepped up, promising to help around the house and run errands, but David grew suspicious of their sudden helpfulness. He began locking his medications in a safe and insisted I be present for all business meetings. He started asking pointed questions about missing tools from job sites and discrepancies in the company books. When confronted, Tom claimed the missing equipment was stolen by disgruntled workers, and Lisa insisted the bookkeeping errors were simple mistakes that could be easily corrected. Kevin became defensive about his activities and friends, accusing David of not trusting him after everything they'd been through together. The medication management became a particular source of tension. David complained that his pills weren't working properly, and that he felt worse after taking them. When he asked to handle his own medications, Margaret became emotional, crying about how hurt she was that he didn't trust her nursing expertise. She guilted him into letting her continue, reminding him how she'd cared for his father during his final illness. But David secretly started checking his medication levels and discovered pills were missing from bottles that should have been full. 2 weeks before David died, he pulled me aside with an urgency I'd never seen before. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were completely lucid as he pressed his old Nikon camera into my hand. The weight of it felt significant, like he was passing along something far more important than photography equipment. He made me promise to keep it safe and told me not to let anyone else touch it, especially his family. When they show their true colors, he whispered, "You'll know what to do with what's inside." I tried to ask what he meant, but he just kissed my forehead and said everything would become clear soon enough. He spent the next week acting normal around his family while working frantically in his darkroom every evening. I could hear him moving around down there, organizing and labeling things with an intensity that worried me. When I offered to help, he gently declined, saying this was something he needed to finish alone. The camera never left my side after that conversation, a constant reminder that David was preparing for something terrible. The morning David died, I found him at the bottom of the stairs leading from our bedroom to the main floor. The fall had been fatal, breaking his neck instantly according to the paramedics. Margaret was already downstairs making coffee, having heard the noise from the guest house. She seemed remarkably composed for someone who had just discovered her son's body, immediately taking charge of the situation and calling the rest of the family before I even thought to reach for my phone. Within hours, our house was full of people making arrangements and decisions as if I wasn't there. Lisa immediately appointed herself coordinator of funeral arrangements, claiming I was too emotional to handle the stress. Tom began making phone calls about the business, telling clients that there would be a temporary transition period while things got sorted out. Kevin disappeared into his basement room and wouldn't come out, even for meal. Margaret stationed herself in David's study, going through his papers and photographs with an efficiency that seemed practiced rather than grief-driven. Everyone had a role to play, and mine was apparently to sit quietly and let them handle everything. The funeral home visits were exercises in exclusion disguised as family solidarity. Every decision was made by committee, but I wasn't included in the committee. The casket, the flowers, the music, the obituary text, even the guest list was determined by people who had barely tolerated David's choice to marry me. When I suggested including some of his photography work in the service display, Lisa dismissed the idea as too personal and artistic for their church community. They wanted a traditional service that honored his role as family patriarch and successful businessman, not his creative passions or personal relationships. The obituary they submitted to the Cedar Ridge Gazette was particularly painful. It mentioned David's successful construction business, his dedication to community service, and his love for his first wife Jennifer, who had preceded him in death after 8 beautiful years of marriage. I was listed at the end as his companion Sarah, who provided comfort during his final years. 15 years of marriage reduced to companionship and comfort, as if I'd been hired help rather than his chosen partner. When I protested, Tom said the newspaper had strict word limits and they had to prioritize the most important relationships. The day before the funeral, I sat alone in our bedroom holding David's camera and trying to understand what he'd wanted me to know. The weight of it felt heavier each day, loaded with secrets I couldn't access without destroying whatever film was inside. I had no experience with developing photographs, and David's darkroom equipment seemed as foreign as rocket science. All I could do was trust that when the right moment came, I would know how to use whatever evidence he'd left for me. That night I dreamed of David standing in his garden with his camera raised, taking pictures of shadows moving through our house. In the dream, the shadows had faces, familiar faces doing unfamiliar things in rooms they didn't belong in. I woke up clutching the camera to my chest, finally understanding that David hadn't just been documenting our life together. He'd been building a case, frame by frame, exposure by exposure, against the people who were supposed to love him most. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and cold, matching the atmosphere that had settled over our home since David's death. I dressed in the simple black dress I'd worn to my mother's funeral 5 years earlier, adding the pearl necklace David had given me for our 10th anniversary. As I prepared to face his family one last time as Miss Mitchell, I slipped the camera strap over my shoulder and under my coat, keeping David's final gift close to my heart where it belonged. Standing in front of the mirror that had reflected our life together for 15 years, I looked at a woman I'd barely recognized. The hopeful bride who had believed love could overcome anything was gone, replaced by someone harder and more aware. I could see in my reflection the same determination that had driven me to become a teacher despite coming from a family that didn't value education. The same strength that had helped me survive my first marriage to an abusive man who tried to convince me I was worthless. The same resilience that had allowed me to love David's son as my own, despite his biological family's resentment. I had been Sarah Thompson, the overlooked middle child, then Sarah Williams, the battered wife, and finally Sarah Mitchell, the patient stepmother. But today I was going to become someone entirely new. Today I was going to become the woman David had always seen in me, the one who deserved respect and justice and truth. The camera pressed against my ribs with each breath, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is patience combined with evidence. As I locked our front door and walked toward the car that would take me to David's funeral, I whispered a promise to the man who had loved me enough to protect me even in death. They thought they had won by reducing me to a footnote in his obituary and a servant at his funeral. But David had taught me that the best photographs require perfect timing, and I was about to discover that revenge, like art, is all about capturing the right moment when the light reveals everything that was hidden in shadow. The funeral director, Mr. Harrison, greeted me at the entrance to Mary's with the practiced sympathy of someone who had perfected the art of professional compassion. His handshake was firm but brief, and I noticed how his eyes immediately shifted to scan the parking lot for the arrival of what he clearly considered the more important family member. I had arrived early, hoping to have a few quiet moments alone with David before the circus began, but even that small dignity was apparently too much to ask for. Lisa appeared behind me like a shadow, her designer black suit making my department store dress look shabby in comparison. She carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being in charge, her perfectly styled blonde hair immune to the October wind that had disheveled my own careful attempts at funeral-appropriate grooming. The contrast between us was intentional and obvious, a visual reminder of the class differences she never let me forget. "Sarah," she said, my name emerging from her lips like something distasteful she needed to spit out. "I'm glad you're here early, we need to discuss the seating arrangement." Her tone was the same one she used with contractors when explaining why their bids weren't quite good enough for her real estate clients. Professional courtesy masking complete dismissal. I clutched David's camera more tightly under my coat, the weight of it grounding me in a way that surprised me. "I assumed I would sit in the front row," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the churning in my stomach. With family, Lisa's laugh was like crystal breaking, sharp and cut. "Oh honey, that's not how this works. The front row is for blood relatives only. David's mother, his children, his siblings, you understand," she gestured toward the sanctuary as if explaining something to a particularly slow child. It's nothing personal, just tradition. Nothing personal. 15 years of marriage dismissed as a quirk of tradition. I watched through the doorway as Margaret Mitchell entered the church, leaning heavily on Kevin's arm in a performance of frailty that fooled no one who had seen her moving around our house with surprising agility just days before. She wore the same black dress she'd worn to every funeral for the past decade, a garment that seemed to exist specifically for occasions where she could claim the spotlight through strategic grief. Tom followed behind them, uncomfortable in a suit that probably hadn't been worn since his last court appearance for unpaid child support. His eyes were bloodshot, and I could smell whiskey on his breath from 10 feet away. This was the man Lisa considered more worthy of front-row seating than the woman who had held David's hand through every doctor's appointment and medication adjustment for the past 18 months. "Where exactly do you suggest I asked, proud that my voice remained level despite the rage building in my chest. The camera pressed against my ribs like a promise, David's final gift reminding me that this humiliation was temporary. Lisa consulted a small notebook with the efficiency of a wedding planner. "I've arranged for you to have a lovely spot in the third row, right behind the Hendersons. They've been so supportive during this difficult time." She gestured vaguely toward the middle of the church, where neighbors and business associates were beginning to gather. The Hendersons were kind people who had lived next door to David for 20 years, but they were acquaintances, not family. Placing me behind them sent a clear message to everyone in attendance about my status in the Mitchell family hierarchy. I was being relegated to the same level as casual friends and work colleagues, despite sharing David's bed and bank account for 15 years. "Lisa, this is ridiculous," I began, but she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the sharp precision of a metronome. She had delivered her verdict and considered the matter closed. Discussion was not welcome, and resistance would only confirm her belief that I lacked the breeding to understand proper funeral etiquette. Kevin approached me with the awkward shuffle of a young man who had been coached on what to say but couldn't quite bring himself to believe it. At 25, he still carried traces of the 10-year-old boy I had helped with spelling homework and driven to soccer practice. But those traces were buried under layers of resentment and entitlement that had hardened over the years. "Hey Sarah," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. "I know this is weird, but Aunt Lisa is just trying to keep things traditional. Dad would have wanted a dignified service." His words sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced them in front of a mirror until they sounded almost believable. I studied his face, searching for any sign of the child who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. "Kevin, I was your father's wife. I think he would have wanted me sitting with his family." He shifted uncomfortably, his hands buried deep in his suit pocket. "Yeah, but you know how Grandma gets when things aren't done the right way. She's already upset about Dad dying, and if we make waves about seating arrangements, it'll just cause more drama." More drama, as if my presence in the front row would somehow dishonor David's memory more than relegating his wife to the back of the church like an unwelcome intruder. I realized that Kevin had already chosen his side, and it wasn't mine. The boy I had raised was prepared to watch me be humiliated rather than stand up to his grandmother and aunt. "I understand," I said, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. The camera seemed to pulse against my side, David's presence reminding me that this moment was exactly what he had prepared for. Margaret approached with the slow, calculated steps of someone who wanted to make sure her entrance was noticed by everyone in the sanctuary. She had perfected the art of dramatic grief over 7 decades, and David's funeral was apparently going to be her masterpiece performance. Her eyes were dry but rimmed with red, as if she had been crying just enough to look appropriately devastated without actually ruining her makeup. "Sarah dear," she said, her voice carrying the false sweetness that had fooled me during our early acquaintance. "I hope you understand that today is about celebrating David's life and his contribution to our family legacy. We need to maintain dignity and proper order during such a difficult time." Proper order, the phrase hung in the air between us like incense, heavy with implications about bloodlines and social hierarchies that I would never be able to navigate correctly. Margaret had spent 15 years making it clear that I was a temporary addition to her son's life, someone to be tolerated until he came to his senses or found someone more suitable. "Of course," I replied, because arguing with a grieving mother at her son's funeral would only confirm everything they had ever said about my lack of breeding and understanding of proper behavior. But the camera pressed against my chest like armor, and I found strength in knowing that David had anticipated this exact conversation. The church was filling with people who represented different chapters of David's life. Construction workers in ill-fitting suits sat next to clients in expensive clothing. Teachers from my school had come to offer support, mixing with neighbors and business associates who formed the social fabric of Cedar Ridge. I watched them file in, wondering how many of them noticed the strange seating arrangement that placed David's widow behind people who barely knew him. Miss Peterson, the church organist, began playing soft hymns that David had never particularly cared for but that Margaret had insisted were appropriate for a Christian service. The music felt hollow and impersonal, nothing like the jazz and blues that David had loved to listen to while working in his darkroom. Even in death, his preferences were being overridden by people who claimed to know what was best for his memory. Lisa reappeared at my side with a small cluster of white carnations, the kind of simple flowers typically given to distant relatives or family friends. The irony wasn't lost on me that the roses and lilies adorning the casket had been chosen and paid for with money from the bank account David and I shared, while I was being handed discount flowers like a consolation prize. "These are for you," she said, pressing the carnations into my hands before I could refuse. "Mother thought you should have something to remember David by." The flowers felt cheap and insubstantial, their stems already beginning to wilt in the warm church air. I looked down at the carnations and then up at Lisa's satisfied expression. She was enjoying this, savoring each small humiliation as payment for 15 years of having to acknowledge my existence in her brother's life. The flowers were meant to be a final insult, a visual representation of my diminished status that everyone in the church would understand. "Thank you," I said, though the words felt like broken glass in my throat. I held the carnations loosely, already planning to leave them on a pew when no one was looking. David's camera was the only thing I needed to carry today, the only memorial that mattered. Tom joined our little group with the unsteady gait of someone who had been drinking steadily since dawn. His grief was the kind that came from a bottle rather than genuine loss, a performance designed to garner sympathy rather than express real emotion. He had borrowed money from David just 3 weeks before the funeral, claiming he needed it for car repairs that never seemed to materialize. "Sarah," he said, his voice slightly slurred despite the early hour, "I want you to know that David loved you. He really did, but family is family, you know? Blood is thicker than water and all that." He swayed slightly as he spoke, his breath reeking of whiskey and poor decision. Blood is thicker than water, the phrase that had been used to justify every exclusion, every dismissal, every moment when I was made to feel like an outsider in my own marriage. Tom delivered it with the confidence of someone quoting scripture, as if genetics automatically conferred wisdom and worthiness regardless of actual behavior or character. "I know David loved me," I replied, my hand instinctively moving to touch the camera through my coat. "And I know he loved all of you too, which is why this would break his heart." Tom's face clouded with confusion, as if the concept of David being hurt by their behavior had never occurred to him. In his mind they were honoring tradition and maintaining family dignity. The idea that their treatment of me might be cruel or inappropriate was apparently beyond his comprehension. The funeral director appeared at my elbow with the practiced timing of someone who had orchestrated hundreds of these ceremonies. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "if you're ready I can show you to your seat. The service will be beginning shortly." I nodded and followed him down the aisle, acutely aware of the whispered conversations that paused as I passed. People who had known David and me as a couple were clearly confused by the seating arrangement, their faces reflecting the awkwardness of witnessing family drama play out during what should have been a solemn occasion. The third row felt like exile. I sat between Miss Henderson from next door and a woman I recognized from the grocery store but whose name I couldn't remember. Around me people shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that something was wrong with this picture but uncertain how to address it without causing more disruption. From my position behind the Hendersons, I had a clear view of the front row where David's blood family had arranged themselves like a royal court. Margaret sat in the center, flanked by Lisa and Tom, with Kevin at the end looking increasingly uncomfortable with the attention their unusual arrangement was drawing. They faced forward with rigid posture, as if acknowledging the whispers and stares would somehow diminish their authority. The casket sat just 20 feet away, but it might as well have been on another continent. I had been separated from my husband by arbitrary rules about bloodlines and tradition, forced to grieve from a distance while people who had barely spoken to him in recent years claimed the closest positions. The carnations in my lap felt like a mockery, wilted reminders of my reduced status. Pastor Williams took his position at the podium and began the service with generic platitudes about loss and eternal rest. His words felt hollow and impersonal, the kind of eulogy that could have been delivered for any deceased parishioner. There was no mention of David's passion for photography, his love of building beautiful homes, or the way he had transformed my life through simple kindness and unwavering support. Lisa had provided the pastor with talking points that emphasized David's role as a successful businessman and devoted family man, carefully editing out any references to our marriage or the life we had built together. According to the official version of his story, David had been a grieving widower who had eventually found companionship in his later years, but whose heart belonged to his first wife and blood relative. As I listened to this sanitized version of David's life, I began to understand the full scope of what they were attempting. This wasn't just about seating arrangements or funeral flowers.
Mrs. Henderson reached over and squeezed my hand during a particularly pointed section of the eulogy about the importance of blood family in times of crisis. Her gesture was small but significant, a reminder that not everyone in the church was fooled by the Mitchell family's attempt to marginalize me. Some people recognized injustice when they saw it, even if they felt powerless to address it directly. The service continued with hymns that David had never liked, and readings that reflected Margaret's religious preferences rather than his spiritual beliefs. Every element had been chosen to reinforce their version of who he had been, carefully omitting anything that acknowledged the man I had known and loved. They were burying not just David's body but also his authentic self, replacing him with a sanitized version that fit their narrative. When the time came for family members to view the casket one final time, I remained seated while the front row filed past in order of assumed importance. Margaret went first, her performance of overwhelming grief so theatrical that several people reached for tissues. Lisa followed with composed dignity, her dry eyes suggesting that her sorrow was more about losing David's financial support than his actual presence. Tom stumbled slightly as he approached the casket, his whiskey-fueled emotions finally surfacing in a display that was more embarrassing than touching. Kevin stood for a long moment, perhaps genuinely grieving the father he had disappointed so deeply in recent years. None of them invited me to join them, and I understood that I was expected to wait until all the real family members had finished their farewells. Finally, Mrs. Henderson stood and gestured for me to accompany her to the casket. Her simple act of inclusion was more meaningful than any of the elaborate floral arrangements or carefully crafted eulogies. She understood that love and commitment mattered more than biology, and she wasn't going to let me be completely erased from David's final moment. I approached the casket with trembling legs, the weight of everyone's attention pressing down on me like a physical force. David looked peaceful in a way that the last months of his life hadn't allowed, free from the pain and medication that had clouded his final week. His hands were folded over his chest, and I noticed that they had removed his wedding ring, probably at Margaret's request. Standing there looking at the man who had been my anchor for 15 years, I whispered a promise that only he could hear. "I'll use what you left me," I said softly. "I'll make sure everyone knows who you really were and who they really are." The camera seemed to grow heavier against my side, as if David's spirit was acknowledging my commitment to see this through to the end. As I turned away from the casket, I caught Lisa's eye and saw something flicker across her face. For just a moment, her composed mask slipped, and I glimpsed the fear underneath her arrogance. She suspected that I might be more than the helpless widow they had painted me to be, but she couldn't quite identify the source of her unease. The processional to the cemetery was another exercise in hierarchy and exclusion. The family car held Margaret, Lisa, Tom and Kevin, while I was directed to ride with the Hendersons in their aging sedan. Even in transportation, the message was clear. I belonged with the neighbors and friends, not with the people who shared David's DNA. As our car followed the hearse through the streets of Cedar Ridge, I watched the familiar landmarks of our shared life pass by the window. The hardware store where David had bought supplies for our home improvement projects. The park where we had walked every evening after dinner. The restaurant where we had celebrated our anniversaries with quiet dinners and shared dreams for the future. All of these places held memories that the Mitchell family wanted to erase, moments that didn't fit their preferred narrative about David's life and priority. But the camera pressed against my chest held evidence that would force them to confront the truth about their behavior and its consequences. David had been patient and methodical in building his case against them, and soon it would be my turn to present the evidence to the world. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, marking the transition from public performance to private reckoning. Whatever they had planned for the graveside service and the aftermath, David had prepared me for this moment, and his final gift would ensure that justice was served, frame by devastating frame. The October wind whipped through Cedar Ridge Cemetery with a bitter edge that cut through even the heaviest coat. Dead leaves swirled around the gathered mourners like nature's own commentary on the day's events, and I pulled my black wool coat tighter around myself, feeling David's camera press reassuringly against my rib. The cemetery had been David's choice for his final resting place, a quiet corner plot under an old oak tree where he had said we could visit his parents' graves together someday. Now I wondered if I would even be allowed to visit him. The hearse wound slowly through the narrow cemetery roads, followed by a procession of cars that seemed to stretch forever in my rearview mirror. David had touched many lives during his 63 years in Cedar Ridge, and people had come from all corners of the community to pay their respect. Construction workers who had learned their trade under his patient guidance drove pickup trucks with company logos. Teachers from my school had taken personal time to attend. Business owners whose buildings David had constructed over the decades formed an impromptu convoy of success stories made manifest in brick and mortar. But as we approached the gravesite, I watched the Mitchell family emerge from their limousine with the coordinated precision of a military unit executing a well-rehearsed operation. Margaret stepped out first, accepting Kevin's offered arm with the practiced fragility of someone who had learned to weaponize her age and grief. Lisa followed, her designer heels somehow managing to navigate the uneven cemetery ground with the confidence of someone who felt entitled to solid footing wherever she stepped. Tom stumbled slightly as he exited the car, his morning whiskey consumption finally beginning to show in his coordination. He caught himself against the car door and attempted to smooth his tie, but the damage to his dignity was already done. Several mourners exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with his obvious intoxication at such a solemn occasion. But Lisa simply linked her arm through his elbow and guided him toward the gravesite as if escorting a distinguished family patriarch rather than a middle-aged alcoholic. The funeral director, Mr. Harrison, had apparently received very specific instructions about the positioning of family members around the grave. He guided Margaret to the place of honor directly beside the casket, with Lisa and Tom flanking her like protective sentries. Kevin was positioned at the foot of the grave, his role as the grieving son requiring him to be visible to all the mourners who had come to offer their condolences. I hung back with the Hendersons, watching this choreographed arrangement with growing understanding of just how thoroughly I had been excluded from David's final moments. The message was clear and public. The Mitchell family consisted of David's mother, his siblings and his son. The woman who had shared his bed, his dreams, and his daily life for 15 years, was relegated to the crowd of neighbors and business associates. Mrs. Henderson must have noticed my expression because she moved closer and whispered, "This is wrong, Sarah. Everyone can see how wrong this." Her words carried the weight of someone who had watched our marriage from next door for 15 years, who had seen David and me working in our garden together every evening, who knew the truth about our relationship regardless of what the Mitchell family wanted people to believe. The positioning became even more pointed when distant relatives began arriving at the gravesite. Cousins who hadn't spoken to David in years were waved forward to stand closer to the casket than his wife. Margaret's sister from Columbus, a woman who had visited exactly twice in the past decade, was given a place of honor in the family section. Even David's ex-brother-in-law from his first marriage, a man who had maintained minimal contact since Jennifer's death 25 years ago, was acknowledged with a respectful nod and a position among the inner circle. I stood behind a cluster of David's former employees, men who had worked for him for decades and respected him deeply, but who clearly felt uncomfortable with the family dynamics playing out before them. These were practical men who understood loyalty and fairness, and they kept glancing back at me with expressions of confusion and concern. Why was the boss's wife standing with the neighbors instead of the family? Why was she holding wilted carnations instead of the elaborate roses that adorned the casket? Pastor Williams took his position at the head of the grave and began the committal service with words about dust returning to dust and eternal rest in the arms of the Lord. His voice carried clearly across the cemetery, but his eyes kept drifting to the unusual family arrangement with obvious discomfort. He had officiated at enough funerals to recognize when family politics were overshadowing genuine grief, and the tension around David's grave was impossible to ignore. Margaret's performance reached new heights during the graveside service. She swayed dramatically against Lisa's supporting arm, her sobs echoing across the cemetery with theatrical precision. Her grief was real, but it was also calculated, designed to reinforce her position as the primary mourner whose loss superseded everyone else. Each sob seemed to emphasize her biological connection to David, her superior claim to devastation and sympathy. Lisa maintained her composure with the cool efficiency of someone managing a difficult business transaction. She kept one arm around her mother while using her free hand to gesture subtly to other family members, coordinating their responses and ensuring that everyone maintained their assigned position. Her eyes constantly scanned the crowd, monitoring reactions and making mental notes of who was watching their family drama unfold. Tom's contribution to the service consisted mainly of swaying slightly and wiping his nose with a handkerchief that already looked well used. His presence added nothing to the solemnity of the occasion, but his biological connection to David apparently made him more worthy of front-row positioning than the woman who had held David's hand through every medical appointment and sleepless night of his final illness. Kevin stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the casket with an expression that might have been grief or might have been guilt. Of all the family members, he seemed most uncomfortable with the exclusion tactics being employed against me. Perhaps some part of him remembered the woman who had packed his school lunches and attended his soccer games, who had helped him with homework and driven him to friends' houses when David was working late. As Pastor Williams spoke about David's contributions to the community and his love for his family, I noticed how carefully the eulogy had been scripted to avoid any mention of our marriage or the life we had built together. Every reference to David's personal relationships focused on his role as son, brother, and father, as if his identity as a husband had ended with Jennifer's death 25 years ago. The cemetery workers stood at a respectful distance, waiting for the family to finish their goodbyes before beginning the burial process. These men had worked with David on various construction projects over the years, and several of them nodded respectfully in my direction when they caught my eye. Their simple acknowledgement meant more to me than all of Margaret's theatrical sobbing, a reminder that not everyone was fooled by the Mitchell family's attempt to rewrite history. When the time came for the final blessing and the ceremonial throwing of dirt onto the casket, I watched the family members take turns performing their last earthly connection to David. Margaret went first, her handful of cemetery soil scattered with trembling fingers, as she whispered something that only she and David could hear. Lisa followed with composed dignity, her small portion of earth falling with the precision of someone completing a necessary task. Tom nearly stumbled as he approached the grave, his coordination compromised by the morning's liquid breakfast. He grabbed a handful of dirt that was too large and scattered it awkwardly, some of it missing the casket entirely and falling onto the artificial grass that surrounded the grave. Kevin's turn was more measured, his young hands steady as he completed what might have been his first genuinely emotional moment of the entire day. Then Pastor Williams looked out at the gathered mourners and spoke the words that every spouse dreads to hear. The family invites those who wish to pay their final respects to come forward. The emphasis on family was slight but unmistakable, a verbal reminder of who held the authority to grant permission for this final ritual. I waited expecting someone to gesture for me to join the family members, or at least to acknowledge my right to participate in this last goodbye. But the Mitchell family stood as a closed unit, their backs forming a wall between David's casket and the rest of the mourners. Their message was clear: I could approach the grave when they were finished, like any other member of the general public paying respects to a deceased community member. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward and took my arm with gentle firmness. "Come on, dear," she said loudly enough for several people to hear. "Let's say goodbye to David together." Her simple act of inclusion cut through the tension like a blade, creating an opening for me to approach the grave without having to wait for permission from people who had spent 15 years making it clear that I would never truly belong. As we walked toward the casket, I was aware of the whispered conversations starting up behind us. People who had known David and me as a couple were finally beginning to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't just unusual funeral logistics or cultural differences in mourning ritual. This was a systematic attempt to erase a 15-year marriage and reduce David's widow to the status of a casual acquaintance. Standing beside David's casket for what I knew would be the last time, I reached into my coat and touched the camera he had entrusted to me. The weight of it seemed to pulse with warmth, as if David's spirit was confirming that this moment of humiliation was exactly what he had prepared for. Whatever evidence he had captured during his final months was waiting to be revealed, and soon his family would understand the consequences of their cruelty. I knelt beside the grave and picked up a handful of the rich Ohio soil that would soon cover the man who had been the center of my world for 15 years. As I let the earth fall through my fingers onto the casket, I whispered words that were meant for David alone. "I promise I'll use what you left me. They won't get away with this." The dirt made a soft pattering sound against the polished wood, and I imagined David's spirit acknowledging my commitment to see his plan through to completion. He had been patient and methodical in everything he did, from building houses to developing photographs to documenting his family's true nature. Now it was my turn to be patient until the right moment arrived to reveal what he had discovered. As I stood up from the graveside, I caught Lisa watching me with an expression that mixed suspicion with contempt. She had noticed my whispered words to David, and something about my demeanor was clearly making her uncomfortable. Perhaps she was beginning to sense that the grieving widow they had dismissed so easily might be more formidable than they had assumed. The crowd of mourners began to disperse slowly, with people offering condolences to the family members and sharing memories of David's impact on their lives. I watched construction workers embrace Kevin with genuine affection, telling stories about his father's fairness and generosity that painted a picture of a man very different from the sanitized version presented in the funeral service. Business owners approached Margaret with stories about David's integrity and craftsmanship, but their words seemed to bounce off her theatrical grief without making any real impression. She was too busy maintaining her performance as the primary mourner to actually listen to what people were saying about her son's character and contributions to the community. Several of my fellow teachers approached to offer support, and their presence reminded me that I did have allies in Cedar Ridge, people who had watched my marriage and recognized it as genuine partnership rather than convenient companionship. Their kindness helped counterbalance the cruelty I was experiencing from David's blood relatives. As the formal cemetery service concluded, Lisa approached me with the false concern that had become her signature expression when delivering particularly pointed messages. "Sarah, we'll be gathering at the house for lunch and to share memories. Mother thought it would be best to keep it to immediate family only. You understand, it's been such an emotional day already. Immediate family only." The house that David and I had shared for 15 years, where I had cooked thousands of meals and tended a garden that had become my sanctuary, was now off limits to me because I lacked the proper genetic credentials. The lunch would undoubtedly be catered with food I hadn't prepared, served on dishes I had carefully chosen and maintained, in rooms I had decorated and cleaned and filled with the artifacts of our shared life. "Of course," I said, because arguing about it would only confirm their belief that I lacked the class and breeding to understand proper behavior during times of grief. But the camera pressed against my chest like a promise, and I found comfort in knowing that David had anticipated this exact conversation and prepared accordingly. Mrs. Henderson appeared at my elbow with perfect timing. "Sarah, we'd love to have you join us for lunch. Several of the neighbors are gathering at our house to share stories about David, real stories, about the man we all knew and loved." Her emphasis on real was subtle but pointed, a reminder that there were people in Cedar Ridge who wouldn't let the Mitchell family completely control the narrative about David's life and character. As I walked away from the gravesite with the Hendersons and several other neighbors, I could feel the Mitchell family watching me with expressions that mixed relief with suspicion. They were glad to have me out of their way for the afternoon, but something about my calm acceptance of their exclusion tactics seemed to be making them uneasy. The walk back to the cars provided an opportunity for quiet conversations that had been impossible during the formal service. People who had known David and me as a couple began expressing their confusion and concern about the family's treatment of me. Their questions were carefully worded, but the subtext was clear. Why was David's wife being treated like an unwelcome stranger at his own funeral? I deflected most of these inquiries with vague references to grief affecting people differently, and family dynamics being complicated during emotional time. But inside I was cataloging every slight, every exclusion, every moment of calculated cruelty that David's family had inflicted throughout the day. Each incident would serve as context for whatever evidence David had left in his camera, building a case for their true character that no one would be able to dismiss or explain away. As we drove away from Cedar Ridge Cemetery, I watched the gravesite growing smaller in the rear window, until it disappeared entirely behind a grove of trees. David was truly gone now, but his spirit lived on in the weight of the camera against my chest and the promise I had made beside his grave. His family thought they had won by successfully marginalizing me during his final services, but they had no idea that their moment of triumph was actually the beginning of their downfall. The afternoon stretched ahead with artificial social gatherings where people would share sanitized memories and avoid difficult truths about family dynamics and character flaws. But eventually all the performances would end, and the real reckoning would begin. David had spent his final months preparing for this day, and soon his careful documentation would reveal everything his family had tried so hard to hide. The camera seemed to grow heavier with each mile we traveled away from the cemetery, as if it were absorbing the weight of all the injustices I had witnessed and storing them for future revelation. David had always been methodical in his approach to problems, whether he was planning a construction project or developing photographs in his basement darkroom. His final project would be no different, patient, thorough, and devastating in its precision. The afternoon at the Hendersons' house provided a stark contrast to the cold formality I had endured all morning. Their living room filled with genuine mourners, who wanted to share real memories of David rather than perform scripted grief for social approval. Construction workers sat beside teachers, neighbors mixed with business clients, and everyone seemed to understand that we were gathering to honor the man we had actually known rather than some sanitized version created for public consumption. Mrs. Henderson had prepared a simple lunch of sandwiches and soup, the kind of comfort food that David had always preferred over fancy catered affairs. As people settled into chairs and found spots on the couch, stories began emerging that painted a picture of David's true character and the impact he had made on countless lives throughout Cedar Ridge. Frank Morrison, one of David's longtime employees, shared how David had quietly paid for his daughter's college tuition when Frank couldn't afford it. "Never asked for anything back," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion, just said education was too important to let money get in the way. That's the kind of man your husband was, Sarah. Janet Williams, who taught 3rd grade at my school, told the room about how David had shown up at her house during a snowstorm to fix her burst pipes, refusing any payment and staying until her heat was restored. He said neighbors help neighbors, and that's what makes a community work. You were lucky to have each other. These stories continued for over an hour, each one revealing another facet of David's generous spirit and practical kindness. He had quietly helped dozens of families through difficult times, built playgrounds for churches that couldn't afford contractors, and mentored young men who needed father figures in their lives. The man being remembered in the Henderson living room bore no resemblance to the detached patriarch described in the morning's formal eulogy. As I listened to these testimonials, I began to understand why David had been so careful to document his family's behavior during his final months. He had known that after his death, they would attempt to control his legacy and reshape his memory to serve their own purpose. The stories being shared today would never be told at the official family gathering, where only sanitized memories that supported their preferred narrative would be allowed. Around 3 o'clock, Kevin appeared at the Hendersons' front door, looking uncomfortable and slightly desperate. His earlier composure had cracked, and he fidgeted with his car keys as Mrs. Henderson invited him inside. Several people in the room fell silent, clearly uncertain about how to react to his presence after witnessing the morning's family dynamic. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who had realized they might have made a terrible mistake. "Could I talk to you for a minute?" Outside, I excused myself from the gathering and followed Kevin onto the front porch, where the October wind immediately cut through my funeral dress. He paced back and forth for a moment, before turning to face me with an expression that mixed guilt with something that might have been genuine remorse. "This morning was fucked up," he said, abandoning the careful language he had used at the church and cemetery. "I know it was. Dad would have hated seeing you treated like that." His words came out in a rush, as if he had been practicing them during the drive over but was still uncertain about his ability to deliver them convincingly. "Then why didn't you say something?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Kevin had spent his entire life learning that challenging the Mitchell family hierarchy brought swift and severe consequences, and old habits were stronger than temporary bursts of conscience. He ran his hands through his hair, destroying the careful styling that had lasted through the morning's services. "Because Aunt Lisa said if I didn't go along with their plan they'd cut me out of everything. The inheritance, the business, all of it. And I've got debts, Sarah. Serious debts that Dad didn't know about." The admission hung between us like a confession, revealing the financial pressure that had shaped his morning's betrayal. Kevin wasn't just a young man choosing sides in a family dispute. He was someone drowning in obligations he couldn't meet without access to David's estate. His loyalty had been purchased with promises of inheritance that would solve problems David had never been told about. "What kind of debt?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. The camera pressed against my chest seemed to grow warmer, as if David's spirit was urging me to ask the questions that would reveal the full scope of his family's deception. Kevin's face flushed red, and he looked away toward the street where cars were still arriving for the informal gathering. "Gambling mostly. Some drug stuff from college that never got resolved. I owe people who don't accept payment plans or negotiate terms." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "They said they'd hurt me if I didn't pay up soon. Drug stuff." The phrase hit me like ice water, revealing a layer of Kevin's problems that explained so much about his recent behavior and David's growing concern about mysterious visitors to our basement. The young man I had helped raise had fallen into the kind of trouble that required serious money to resolve, the kind of money that could only come from a substantial inheritance. "How much do you owe?" The question emerged before I could stop myself, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. $47,000, he said, the number falling between us like a stone into still water. "Maybe more with interest and penalties." I stopped keeping exact track when it got scary. $47,000. The amount represented more money than Kevin had ever legitimately earned in his 25 years, the kind of debt that could only accumulate through serious gambling addiction or involvement in illegal activity. No wonder Lisa had been able to purchase his cooperation so easily. He was facing consequences that made family dynamics seem trivial by comparison. "Kevin, your father would have helped you if you had just asked," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if that was still true. David had been growing increasingly suspicious of Kevin's activities and associates during his final months, and perhaps he had already discovered more than any of us realized. Would he? Kevin's laugh was bitter and self-aware. He was already asking questions about my friends and where I was getting money for things. "He searched my room last month. Sarah, went through everything like I was some kind of criminal." The hurt in his voice was genuine, but it was mixed with guilt that suggested David's suspicions might have been well-founded. Maybe he was trying to help, I offered, though the camera against my chest was pulsing with warmth that suggested David's investigation had uncovered more than fatherly concern could address. Kevin shook his head, his composure finally beginning to crack completely. He found things, pictures and documents that I thought I had hidden well enough. He didn't say anything directly, but I could tell he was putting pieces together. That's when Aunt Lisa approached me with her plan. Pictures and documents. The words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the October wind. If David had been investigating Kevin's activities and discovering evidence of illegal behavior, then Lisa's timing suggested she had known about his findings and moved quickly to neutralize any threat they might pose to the family's reputation and financial security. What kind of picture? I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. Kevin's face went pale and he glanced toward the Henderson house as if checking to make sure no one inside could overhear our conversation.
Pictures of me with people I shouldn't have been associating with. Documents showing money transfers that wouldn't look good if anyone official saw them. Evidence of things that could have gotten me arrested. The confession painted a picture that explained so much about the family dynamics I had witnessed during David's final months. Lisa hadn't just been concerned about inheritance distribution or family hierarchy. She had been protecting Kevin from legal consequences that could have destroyed the entire Mitchell family reputation. David's investigation had apparently uncovered criminal activity that threatened everything they had built over generations. "Sarah, I need you to know that I never wanted Dad to get hurt," Kevin continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But these people I owe money to, they don't care about family feelings or funeral arrangements. They want their money and they've made it clear what happens if they don't get it." The implication behind his words was terrifying. Kevin wasn't just dealing with gambling debts or college mistakes. He was involved with people who used violence to collect on their investment. His cooperation with Lisa's humiliation campaign hadn't just been about greed or family loyalty. It had been about survival in a world where debts were paid in blood if money wasn't available. Where do things stand now? I asked, though I suspected the answer would only confirm my worst fears about the morning's events. "The will reading is tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Kevin said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "Peterson and Associates on Main Street." Lisa said, "If everything goes according to plan, I'll have enough money to pay off my debts and start fresh." His words carried the desperate hope of someone who had been promised salvation but wasn't entirely convinced it would materialize. I looked at the notice he handed me, seeing my own name listed among the beneficiaries expected to attend the reading of David's last will and testament. The formal language was cold and impersonal, reducing 15 years of marriage to a single line in a legal document that would determine the distribution of assets I had helped accumulate through years of shared effort and sacrifice. "Kevin, what if things don't go according to Lisa's plan?" I asked, though the camera pressed against my chest seemed to be warming in preparation for exactly that scenario. His face went white, and for a moment he looked like the frightened 10-year-old boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. "Then I'm probably dead within a week," he said simply. "These aren't people who give second chances or accept excuses. They want their money and they don't care how I get it." The stark honesty of his admission revealed the true stakes behind the morning's cruel theater. This wasn't just about inheritance distribution or family hierarchy. It was about life and death, criminal activity and legal consequences. Survival in a world where violence was a standard business practice. Kevin's betrayal of me had been motivated by terror rather than greed, though the distinction provided little comfort. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "I know what we did today was wrong. I know Dad loved you and would have hated seeing you treated like that. But I didn't have a choice. Everyone has choices, I thought, but some choices come with consequences that make them impossible to consider seriously." Kevin had chosen criminal associates and illegal activities that had trapped him in a situation where family loyalty became a luxury he couldn't afford. His apology was genuine, but it changed nothing about the morning's humiliation or the evening's aftermath. "I understand," I said, though understanding and forgiveness were very different things. The camera against my chest seemed to pulse with warmth that suggested David had understood too, and had prepared accordingly for this exact conversation. Kevin nodded gratefully and turned to leave but stopped after taking 2 steps toward his car. "Sarah, there's something else you should know about tomorrow's will reading." His voice carried a warning that made the hair on my arms stand up despite my warm coat. "What about it?" "Lisa has been working with Peterson for weeks, going over documents and making sure everything is arranged properly. She said there might be some surprises but that everything would work out for the best in the end." His words were carefully chosen, but the subtext was clear.
Lisa had been manipulating the legal process to ensure outcomes that served her purposes rather than David's actual intentions. What kind of surprise? Kevin's face reflected genuine uncertainty, as if he had been told just enough to ensure his cooperation but not enough to fully understand the scope of Lisa's planning. I don't know exactly, but she's been very confident about how things will turn out, like she knows something the rest of us don't. The warning sent ice through my veins, but the camera pressed against my chest provided warmth that reminded me David had anticipated this possibility. Whatever Lisa had planned for tomorrow's will reading, David had spent his final months preparing countermeasures that would ensure justice was served regardless of her manipulations. "Thank you for telling me," I said, and meant it despite everything else. Kevin's warning might have been motivated by guilt rather than loyalty, but it provided valuable intelligence about what to expect from the legal proceedings that would determine my financial future. He nodded and walked quickly to his car, leaving me alone on the Henderson porch with questions that multiplied faster than answers. The informal gathering inside continued without me, filled with people sharing genuine memories of David's character and impact on their lives. But tomorrow's will reading would feature a very different group of people with very different motivations, and I needed to be prepared for whatever surprises Lisa had arranged. As I rejoined the gathering inside, Miss Henderson immediately sensed my distress and guided me to a quiet corner where we could speak privately. "What did that boy want?" she asked, her protective instincts clearly activated by whatever she had observed through the window. "To apologize for this morning," I said, though that was only part of the truth. The full truth about Kevin's criminal debts and Lisa's legal manipulations was too complex and dangerous to share with well-meaning neighbors who couldn't protect themselves from the consequences of such knowledge. "Too little, too late," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Some things can't be fixed with apologies, especially when they're delivered after the damage is done." Her moral clarity was refreshing after a day of performance and manipulation, a reminder that some people still believed in basic decency regardless of financial pressures or family politics. The gathering continued for another hour, with stories and memories that painted a complete picture of David's character and contributions to the Cedar Ridge community. As people began preparing to leave, several approached me with offers of support and assistance during the difficult transition ahead. Their kindness provided a sharp contrast to the cold calculation I had experienced from David's blood relatives, reminding me that family could be chosen as well as inherited. As the evening shadows lengthened and the last guests departed, I found myself alone with the Hendersons in their quiet living room. The day's events felt surreal, like scenes from someone else's life that I had been forced to witness and participate in despite having no real connection to the characters or plot. "You're welcome to stay here tonight," Mrs. Henderson offered. "I know that house must feel different now, with all the family tensions and everything that's happened." The offer was tempting, but I needed to return to the home David and I had shared, to the dark room where his final project waited to be discovered and developed. Whatever evidence he had captured during his last months was hidden somewhere in that basement space, and tomorrow's will reading would determine whether I had the legal right to access and use it. "Thank you, but I need to go home," I said. "There are things David left for me that I need to." Mrs. Henderson nodded understandingly, though she couldn't possibly comprehend the full implications of what I was facing. "You call us if you need anything at all," she said firmly. "Day or night, we're right next door and happy to help however we can." As I drove the short distance from the Henderson house to the home David and I had shared for 15 years, I felt the weight of the camera against my chest like a heartbeat counting down to tomorrow's reckoning. Whatever Lisa had planned for the will reading, whatever Kevin's debts required, whatever legal manipulations had been arranged during David's final illness, the camera held evidence that would reveal the truth about everything. The house felt different as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer where David's coat still hung on its usual hook. His presence lingered in every room, from the coffee cup he had left unwashed in the kitchen sink to the book lying open on his nightstand with a bookmark marking his place in a story he would never finish reading. But it was the basement that called to me most urgently, the dark room where David had spent his final weeks working on a project that would ensure justice was served regardless of his family's scheme. As I descended the stairs with the camera clutched tightly in my hands, I could almost hear David's voice encouraging me to be patient and methodical, to develop the evidence carefully and present it at exactly the right moment for maximum impact. Tomorrow's will reading would determine the official distribution of David's estate, but tonight belonged to discovering the truth he had preserved for me in silver and shadow, frame by devastating frame. The camera's weight against my chest had been a promise throughout the day's humiliation, and now it was time to develop that promise into the evidence that would change everything. The basement felt different as I descended the wooden stairs, each creak echoing through the silence like a countdown to revelation. David's dark room occupied the far corner of our basement, a space he had converted with meticulous care into his private sanctuary, where light and chemistry transformed captured moments into permanent memory. The familiar smell of developer and fixer chemicals hung in the air, mixed with something else that I couldn't immediately identify but that made my skin prickle with anticipation. Red light filtered through the safe light mounted on the wall, casting everything in the crimson glow that David had always said was the color of truth emerging from darkness. His enlarger stood ready in the center of the room, surrounded by developing trays arranged with the precision of a surgeon's instruments. Strips of negatives hung from clips attached to a wire line stretched across one wall, their images invisible in the dim light but somehow radiating importance. I set David's camera carefully on the counter beside his enlarger and began searching through the cabinets where he stored his developing supplies and finished photographs. Everything was organized with typical David efficiency, labeled containers arranged alphabetically and chronologically, contact sheets filed in order of completion. But hidden behind the everyday photography supplies, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. A manila envelope marked for Sarah, open after funeral, sat propped against the back wall of the supply cabinet, positioned where only someone familiar with David's organization system would think to look. My hands trembled as I lifted it, feeling the weight of multiple photographs and documents inside. David's handwriting on the outside was shaky but determined, the script of a man fighting illness and medication to complete a crucial task. Inside the envelope I found a letter written in David's careful handwriting, along with contact sheets showing dozens of photographs taken throughout our house and around Cedar Ridge over the past several months. The letter was dated just 1 week before David's death, and reading his words felt like hearing his voice speak directly to my heart across the barrier of mortality. "My darling Sarah," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone and my family has shown their true nature at my funeral. I have spent the last 6 months documenting evidence of crimes and betrayals that would destroy us both if revealed while I was alive. But now that I am gone, you have the power to ensure that justice is served and that my real wishes are honored." I continued reading with growing amazement as David detailed a systematic investigation that had uncovered layers of deception I never could have imagined. He had installed hidden cameras throughout our house after becoming suspicious of Kevin's activities and his family's sudden interest in his health and finances. What he discovered was a network of illegal activities and conspiracies that reached far beyond simple inheritance dispute. The photographs told a story that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Image after image showed Kevin dealing drugs from our basement, using our home as a distribution center for operations that put us both at risk of federal prosecution. Lisa appeared in several photographs meeting with Kevin and exchanging envelopes that clearly contained money, her involvement in his illegal activities making her an accessory to crimes that could have destroyed the entire family's reputation. But the most devastating photographs showed Margaret systematically stealing David's heart medication and replacing it with sugar pills, a deliberate attempt to weaken his health and accelerate his death. The images captured her in our kitchen late at night, emptying pill bottles and refilling them with harmless substitutes while David slept upstairs, trusting the woman who had given birth to him to manage his medical care properly. Tom's theft of construction equipment and tools was documented in excruciating detail, showing him loading company property into his truck and driving it to locations where he sold it to finance his drinking and gambling habit. The photographs revealed a systematic embezzlement operation that had been bleeding David's business for months, undermining the financial stability of a company that employed dozens of families throughout Cedar Ridge. Even Harold Peterson, the family attorney, appeared in several photographs meeting secretly with Lisa and reviewing documents that were clearly forgery. The images showed them practicing David's signature and comparing it to authentic examples, preparing false wills and estate documents that would ensure the family could steal everything David had worked his entire life to build. But it was the audio recordings that accompanied the photographs that truly revealed the depth of their betrayal. David had hidden recording devices throughout the house, capturing conversations that exposed their complete contempt for both him and me. I listened in horror as they casually discussed accelerating his death through medication tampering and deliberate stress, treating his murder as nothing more than a scheduling problem to be solved efficiently. "The old man is taking too long to die," Lisa's voice came through clearly on one recording made just 2 weeks before David's death. "We need to speed things up before he changes his mind about the will again, or gets suspicious about what Kevin's been doing in the basement." "Mom's handling the medication situation," Tom replied, his words slurred by alcohol but his meaning crystal clear. "A few more weeks of sugar pills instead of heart medication should do the trick." Then we can blame it on natural causes and move forward with our plan. Margaret's voice joined the conversation with chilling practicality. The stairs have been very convenient for accidents lately. David never uses the handrail anymore, and all those medications make him dizzy. Sometimes old people just fall. The casual way they discussed murdering David for his money made my stomach turn, but it was Kevin's participation that broke my heart completely. The young man I had helped raise was an active participant in planning his father's death, motivated by gambling debts and drug money that had made him desperate enough to betray the man who had loved him unconditionally. I can't keep stalling the people I owe money to much longer. Kevin's voice came through one of the recordings made just days before David's death. They're getting impatient, and they've made it clear what happens if I don't pay up soon. We need to move faster on this whole thing. Don't worry, Lisa assured him. Everything is arranged. Peterson has the false will ready, and Mom knows exactly how to handle the medication situation. Your father will be gone within the week, and then we can distribute his assets according to our needs rather than his sentimental attachments. Their sentimental attachments. 15 years of marriage reduced to sentimental attachment that could be dismissed and erased whenever convenient. I sat in David's dark room, listening to his family plan his murder with the same casual efficiency they might use to organize a dinner party, and I understood why he had spent his final months preparing this evidence for me. The final recordings were the most damning, capturing conversations that took place after David's death, but before his funeral. Lisa's voice detailed the specific humiliations they planned to inflict on me during the services, each calculated cruelty designed to establish their dominance and my inferior status in preparation for the will reading that would leave me with nothing. We need to make it clear from the beginning that she doesn't belong, Lisa explained to Margaret with clinical precision. The seating arrangements, the flowers, the family car, everything should reinforce the message that she was never really part of this family. When Peterson reads the will tomorrow, no one should be surprised that David left everything to his real relatives. Margaret's response was equally cold and calculating. I've already arranged for the newspapers to run the obituary we prepared, the one that describes her as David's companion rather than his wife. By the time we're finished, everyone in Cedar Ridge will understand that their marriage was just a convenience arrangement that ended with his death. The recordings continued with detailed planning for the will reading, including specific instructions Peterson had received about presenting the forged documents and handling any questions I might raise about their authenticity. They had choreographed every aspect of my financial destruction with the same attention to detail that David had brought to his construction projects. But David had been equally methodical in documenting their crimes and preparing evidence that would ensure justice was served. Hidden among his photography supplies, I found a second envelope containing legal documents that revealed the true scope of his preparations for this moment. 3 years earlier, he had quietly transferred all major assets into my name alone, ensuring that the property and investments his family planned to steal had never actually belonged to him at the time of his death. The house we lived in, the construction business that employed half of Cedar Ridge, the investment accounts that represented decades of careful saving, even the vintage car collection that Tom was already planning to sell, everything had been legally mine for years. The will that Peterson would read tomorrow was completely irrelevant, because it pertained to assets that David no longer owned at the time of his death. David's letter explained his reasoning with the clarity of someone who had spent months considering every possible angle and consequence. I knew they would never accept you as family while I was alive, he wrote, but I also knew they would reveal their true nature once I was gone. By transferring everything to you years ago, I ensured that their greed would expose them to criminal prosecution while protecting you from their schemes. The legal documents were accompanied by contact information for Detective Maria Santos, a federal investigator who specialized in elder abuse and inheritance fraud. David had been cooperating with her investigation for months, providing evidence of his family's crimes while building a case that would ensure they faced serious prison time for their betrayal. Detective Santos is expecting your call, David's letter continued. She has copies of all the evidence I've gathered, and she's prepared to arrest them immediately after tomorrow's will reading. But the choice of timing is yours, Sarah. You can end this whenever you feel ready to see justice served. I spent the next several hours in the darkroom, developing the photographs David had taken and reviewing the mountain of evidence he had assembled against his own family. Each image told part of a larger story about greed, betrayal, and the lengths people would go to steal what they felt entitled to inherit. But it was also a story about love, patience, and the determination of one man to protect his wife from people who saw her as an obstacle to their financial ambition. The house felt different as I finally emerged from the basement, carrying the weight of knowledge that would change everything tomorrow. David's spirit seemed to linger in every room, but now his presence felt protective rather than mournful, as if he was standing guard over evidence that would ensure his real wishes were honored and his true character was remembered. I spent the rest of the night organizing the photographs and recordings into a presentation that would devastate David's family when Detective Santos revealed it during tomorrow's will reading. Each piece of evidence was carefully labeled and arranged to tell the complete story of their conspiracy, from Kevin's drug dealing to Margaret's attempted murder through medication tampering. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, I prepared for what I knew would be the most important day of my life. The will reading at Peterson's office would begin with his family expecting to watch me be financially destroyed and emotionally humiliated. Instead, they would discover that their careful planning had trapped them in a web of criminal evidence that would send them all to prison for decades. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that projected confidence and authority rather than the grieving widow role they expected me to play. David's camera hung around my neck like a talisman, filled with film that had captured the evidence of their betrayal. The weight of it reminded me that justice was finally within reach, that David's patient planning was about to bear fruit in spectacular fashion. The drive to Peterson's office took me through the heart of Cedar Ridge, past the buildings David had constructed and the neighborhoods where families lived in homes he had built with pride and craftsmanship. His legacy was written in brick and mortar throughout the community, but today his family would discover that his most important legacy was the evidence he had left to protect the woman he loved. Peterson and Associates occupied a restored Victorian mansion on Main Street, its elegant facade hiding the corruption that had taken root within its legal offices. I arrived early and sat in my car for several minutes, watching as David's family members arrived with the confidence of people who believed their victory was assured. Lisa emerged from her luxury sedan, wearing a black designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Margaret leaned heavily on Kevin's arm as they walked toward the building, her performance of frailty already beginning in preparation for the sympathy she expected to receive as the grieving mother. Tom stumbled slightly as he got out of his truck, his morning drinking already evident in his unsteady gait. They gathered on the sidewalk outside Peterson's office, their body language radiating satisfaction and anticipation. Lisa checked her phone constantly, probably confirming final details with Peterson about the forged documents they planned to present. Margaret adjusted her black dress with theatrical precision, preparing for another performance of overwhelming grief that would justify their treatment of me. Kevin stood apart from the others, his discomfort obvious even from a distance. The warnings he had given me yesterday suggested that some part of him understood the magnitude of what they were about to attempt, but his gambling debts had made him too desperate to consider backing out now. As I walked toward the building, I caught Lisa's eye and saw something flicker across her face that might have been uncertainty. Perhaps something about my demeanor suggested that I wasn't the broken widow they expected to face today. The camera around my neck was clearly visible, and I noticed her gaze lingering on it with what looked like growing concern. "Sarah," Margaret said as I approached, her voice carrying false sympathy that fooled no one. "I hope you slept well, dear. Today is going to be difficult for all of us." "I'm prepared for whatever today brings," I replied, my voice steady and confident in a way that clearly surprised them. The camera felt warm against my chest, David's presence reminding me that this moment was exactly what he had spent months preparing for. Peterson's receptionist ushered us into a conference room where the lawyer waited with documents spread across a polished table. His nervous energy was even more pronounced today, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October weather. When he saw the camera around my neck, his face went pale and his hands began trembling as he shuffled through papers with obvious agitation. "Shall we begin?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly as he opened the folder containing what they all believed was David's last will and testament.
But the camera pressed against my chest held evidence that would transform this meeting from a legal proceeding into the beginning of their criminal prosecution. As Peterson began reading the forged will that would leave me with nothing while enriching David's blood relatives, I sat quietly and waited for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. David had taught me that the best photographs required patience and precise timing, and I was about to capture the moment when justice finally emerged from the shadows to claim its rightful place in the light. The reading proceeded exactly as they had planned, with each family member receiving substantial inheritances while I was dismissed with a token bequest that insulted 15 years of marriage. But when Peterson finished and asked if there were any questions, I stood up slowly and pulled out my phone to dial the number David had left for me. "Detective Santos," I said clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "This is Sarah Mitchell. I'm ready to present the evidence now." The transformation in their faces was immediate and beautiful, confidence melting into terror as they realized that their carefully planned victory had become the trap that would destroy them all.
David's final gift to me wasn't just financial security or legal protection. It was the satisfaction of watching justice served with photographic precision, frame by devastating frame. The silence in Peterson's conference room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap as Detective Santos's voice came through my phone's speaker with professional authority that cut through the morning air like a blade. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm in the parking lot with my team. We'll be up in 30 seconds. Peterson's face had gone from pale to gray to a sickly green that matched the antique wallpaper in his supposedly prestigious office. The documents in his hands trembled so violently that several papers fluttered to the floor like dying birds. His career, his reputation, his freedom, everything he had built over decades of legal practice was about to crumble because he had chosen greed over integrity when Lisa approached him with her inheritance scheme. Lisa's composure shattered like expensive crystal hitting concrete. The woman who had orchestrated my humiliation at David's funeral with surgical precision now stared at me with eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Her manicured fingers clutched the edge of the conference table so tightly that her knuckles went white, and I could see her mind racing as she tried to understand how the grieving widow she had dismissed so easily had become the architect of her destruction. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of heavy footsteps climbing the stairs outside Peterson's office. The authority and condescension that had characterized every interaction we'd had over 15 years had evaporated, replaced by the desperate panic of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Margaret's theatrical grief performance ended abruptly as the reality of her situation penetrated the fog of her manufactured sorrow. The frail elderly woman who had leaned so heavily on Kevin's arm during the funeral procession now sat rigid in her chair, her face cycling through expressions of shock, fear, and calculation, as she tried to find some way to minimize the consequences of her crime. Tom's reaction was the most immediate and visceral. The man who had spent the morning fortifying himself with liquid courage began hyperventilating as the alcohol in his system amplified his panic response. He pushed back from the conference table so forcefully that his chair toppled backward, sending him stumbling toward the window as if contemplating escape from the second-story office. Kevin simply stared at me with a mixture of betrayal and resignation that suggested he had always known this moment would come eventually. His gambling debts and drug dealing had trapped him in a spiral of increasingly desperate choices, and perhaps some part of him was relieved that the pretense was finally over. The young man I had helped raise was about to face the consequences of decisions that had transformed him from David's beloved son into his murderer. Detective Santos entered the conference room with 3 uniformed officers, her presence immediately transforming the space from a legal proceeding into a crime scene investigation. She was a compact woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen enough human corruption to recognize it instantly in any form. Her professional demeanor radiated competence and authority that made Peterson's nervous energy look even more pathetic by comparison. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar arrests. "I'm Detective Maria Santos with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. We're here to execute arrest warrants related to conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, and murder in the death of David Mitchell." Murder. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire, confirming what David's hidden recordings had revealed about his family's intention. This wasn't just about inheritance fraud or document forgery. They had killed him as surely as if they had pushed him down those stairs themselves, using medication tampering and deliberate stress to weaken his heart until it gave out under the pressure they had created. Peterson made a sound somewhere between a whimper and a groan as Detective Santos approached his position at the head of the conference table. "Harold Peterson," she announced formally, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and accessory to murder. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The handcuffs clicked into place with a finality that echoed through the room like a judge's gavel, and Peterson's legs gave out completely. He would have collapsed if not for the officers supporting his arm as they read him his rights. His law practice was finished, his reputation destroyed, his freedom forfeit because he had allowed greed to override professional ethics, when Lisa offered him enough money to compromise his integrity. Lisa's arrest was next, and she met it with the same cold calculation that had characterized her treatment of me throughout our 15-year relationship. She didn't cry or beg or attempt to deny the charges. Instead, she listened to her rights being read with the focused attention of someone already planning her legal defense strategy. Even in defeat, she maintained the composed superiority that had made her such a formidable adversary. "Lisa Porter," Detective Santos continued, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, fraud, and drug trafficking. Your coordination of this criminal enterprise makes you liable for all crimes committed by your co-conspirators. Drug trafficking. The additional charge revealed that David's investigation had uncovered the full scope of Kevin's illegal activities and Lisa's role in facilitating them. She hadn't just been helping Kevin steal David's inheritance. She had been actively participating in the drug dealing operation that had been running out of our basement for months. Margaret's arrest was perhaps the most satisfying because it stripped away the protective veneer of age and frailty that she had used to manipulate sympathy while committing horrible crime. Detective Santos showed no deference to her elderly status as she placed the handcuffs around wrists that had opened pill bottles and replaced life-saving medication with harmless sugar tablets. Margaret Mitchell, the detective announced, "You're under arrest for attempted murder through medication tampering, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Your actions directly contributed to your son's death and constitute some of the most callous crimes I've investigated in 20 years of law enforcement." The accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow, and for the first time since David's death, her emotion appeared genuine rather than theatrical. The reality of being publicly identified as her son's killer penetrated even her self-serving delusions, and she began sobbing with the ugly desperation of someone whose carefully maintained self-image had been destroyed forever. Tom's arrest was complicated by his alcohol-induced panic attack, which required medical attention before the officers could safely transport him to jail. His face had turned an alarming shade of purple, and his breathing was so labored that Detective Santos called for paramedics while maintaining custody of a man whose theft and embezzlement had contributed to the financial pressures that motivated David's murder. "Thomas Mitchell," she said once the paramedics had stabilized his condition, "you're under arrest for embezzlement, theft, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Your systematic theft from Mitchell Construction created the financial desperation that motivated this entire criminal conspiracy." Kevin's arrest was the most heartbreaking because it represented the complete destruction of a young man who had once shown promise before addiction and criminal associations led him down a path that ended with his father's death. He didn't resist or protest as the handcuffs were applied. Instead, he looked directly at me with an expression that might have been relief mixed with genuine remorse. "Kevin Mitchell," Detective Santos concluded, "you're under arrest for drug trafficking, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory to murder. Your gambling debts and drug dealing provided the motivation for murdering your father and attempting to steal his estate." As the officers prepared to escort the Mitchell family members from Peterson's office, Detective Santos approached me with a folder containing legal documents that would formalize what David had already arranged through his careful estate planning. The contrast between her professional respect and the dismissive cruelty I had endured from David's family couldn't have been more stark or satisfying. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, "we'll need you to come to the station later today to provide formal statements and review additional evidence. But I want you to know that your husband's cooperation with our investigation has given us one of the strongest elder abuse cases I've ever seen. These people will spend decades in prison for what they did to him and attempted to do to you." The folder she handed me contained official confirmation of what David's hidden letter had revealed. Every major asset in his estate had been legally transferred to my name years before his death. The house, the construction business, the investment accounts, even the vintage car collection that Tom had been planning to sell, everything belonged to me free and clear of any claims from his blood relative. "The will they tried to present today is completely irrelevant," Detective Santos explained as Peterson was led away in handcuffs. "Your husband transferred ownership of all significant assets to you between 3 and 5 years ago depending on the specific property. Even if their forged will had been accepted by the court, it wouldn't have affected your legal ownership of his estate." The news meant that David's family had committed multiple felonies and destroyed their lives in pursuit of assets that had never been available for them to steal. Their greed had blinded them to the possibility that David might have anticipated their betrayal and taken steps to protect both his estate and his wife from their criminal scheme. As the last of the Mitchell family members was escorted from the building, I found myself alone in Peterson's conference room with Detective Santos and a pile of forged documents that represented months of criminal planning. The silence felt different from the tension that had filled the space just minutes earlier. Now it carried the weight of justice served and truth revealed after years of careful patience. "Your husband was a remarkable man," Detective Santos said as she organized evidence files for transport to the courthouse. "Most people in his situation would have confronted their family directly or tried to handle the situation privately. But David understood that documentation and legal procedure would provide the only path to real justice." She was right about David's character and approach to problems. Throughout our marriage, he had demonstrated the same methodical patience in dealing with family conflicts that he brought to construction projects and photography. He never acted impulsively or emotionally. Instead, he gathered information, considered all possible outcomes, and developed comprehensive plans that addressed every foreseeable contingency. The evidence he compiled is extraordinary, the detective continued. Hidden cameras, audio recordings, financial records, medical documentation, witness statements, everything organized and labeled with scientific precision. I've been investigating white-collar crime for 2 decades, and I've never seen such thorough preparation by a civilian victim. The praise for David's investigative work filled me with pride that mixed with grief for the man who had spent his final months working alone to protect me from dangers I hadn't even recognized. While I had been focused on caring for his medical needs and managing his daily comfort, he had been conducting a complex criminal investigation that would ensure his murderers faced appropriate consequences. What happens now? I asked, though the legal process seemed less important than the emotional closure that came from seeing David's killers arrested and his real wishes honored. They'll be arraigned tomorrow morning, Detective Santos explained. Given the strength of the evidence and the severity of the charges, I expect they'll all be denied bail. The drug trafficking and murder charges carry mandatory minimum sentences that will keep them in prison for decades, assuming they don't accept plea bargains that require full cooperation with our ongoing investigation. The detective's words painted a picture of legal consequences that matched the magnitude of their crimes. Lisa's coordination of the conspiracy would likely earn her the harshest sentence, while Margaret's medication tampering could result in charges equivalent to attempted murder. Tom's embezzlement and Kevin's drug dealing were serious felonies in their own right, but their participation in David's murder elevated them to capital crimes that carried life sentences. There's something else you should know, Detective Santos added as she prepared to leave. Your husband's cooperation with our investigation has helped us identify a larger criminal network that extends far beyond your family's situation. Kevin's drug suppliers and gambling creditors are part of an organization we've been tracking for months, and David's evidence has given us the break we needed to make arrests throughout their operation. The revelation meant that David's death had not been in vain, that his careful documentation would help protect other families from the violence and corruption that had destroyed his own. His final act of love and protection had ripple effects that would extend far beyond our personal situation, delivering justice to criminals who had terrorized the Cedar Ridge community for years. As I left Peterson's office and walked toward my car, I felt David's presence surrounding me like a warm embrace. The camera around my neck had fulfilled its purpose, serving as both evidence container and symbolic reminder of his enduring love and protection. Justice had been served with the precision and patience that had characterized everything David did, from building houses to developing photographs to documenting the crimes that led to his murder. The drive home took me past construction sites where David's crews were working on projects he had designed and scheduled before his death. The business would continue under my ownership, guided by supervisors who understood his standards and vision. His legacy would live on in every building they completed, every family whose dreams were realized through homes he had planned. The house felt different as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer where David's coat still hung on its familiar hook. His physical presence was gone, but his spirit filled every room with the satisfaction of a man whose final project had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. The family that had tried to erase his memory and steal his life's work would spend the rest of their lives paying for their betrayal. In the basement dark room where David had spent his final weeks preparing evidence that would ensure justice was served, I found a final envelope I had missed during my earlier search. Inside was a single photograph of David and me taken on our wedding day 15 years earlier, along with a note written in his shaky handwriting just days before his death. My beloved Sarah, the note read, "If you are reading this, then justice has been served and our love has triumphed over their hatred. You were never below them, never less than them, never unworthy of the respect and dignity they refused to give you. You were always my equal, my partner, my heart. Now you are free to live the life we dreamed of building together, surrounded by people who recognize your worth and appreciate your strength." The photograph showed us young and hopeful, gazing at each other with the certainty of people who had found their perfect match despite all the obstacles the world could place in their path. David's eyes in the picture held the same love and determination that had motivated his final investigation, the same patient strength that had protected me even after death claimed his physical presence. As evening fell over Cedar Ridge, I sat in David's favorite chair in our living room, surrounded by the artifacts of a life well lived and the love that had transcended mortality itself. The camera that had carried his evidence rested on the table beside me, its mission completed and its secrets revealed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as I took control of the business and navigated the legal proceedings that would formalize the Mitchell family's punishment. But tonight belonged to remembrance and gratitude for a man who had loved me enough to spend his dying months ensuring that justice would be served and truth would prevail. David's final gift wasn't just financial security or legal protection, it was the knowledge that real love never dies. It just transforms into something powerful enough to reach across the grave and deliver justice with photographic precision. The house settled around me with the comfortable sounds of a home that had sheltered genuine love and witnessed authentic partnership. Outside, Cedar Ridge slept peacefully under the protection of laws that David's evidence had helped enforce. Inside, his widow sat surrounded by proof that patience, preparation, and unwavering love could overcome any betrayal and ensure that justice, like truth, would always emerge from darkness into light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.